Welcome to the final week of our summer course. I hope everyone is doing well, that you're keeping up with everything, not getting too stressed out. So this week we'll talk about two other approaches to ethics that are different than utilitarianism and deontology. The first in this lecture is on care ethics, which is typically associated with sort of a feminist approach to ethics. So first of all, the very notion of talking about women or suggesting that women have a different approach to ethics, right, already sort of opens up a kind of a cauldron of debate, right? So in the past, when you talked about differences between men and women, that was often used as a way to sort of belittle women or keep them down, right? So some of the differences between women in the past have been things like, oh, women are somehow considered less rational, more emotional, more suited to work in the home, or whatever, right? And it turns out that many, if not all of those, were not like any sort of empirical fact or some sort of natural fact, right? But were simply sort of pretexts for sort of kind of oppression, right? So a feature of like what they call the second wave feminism of the 60s and the 70s uh, was to deny any gender differences whatsoever, right? And to say that if there are any sort of statistical differences, sometimes you can measure certain attributes and those can be empirically there will be differences, but then there's always the question, well, is that difference a matter of sort of nature or nurture, right? So if it's the result of social conditioning, then in that case, uh, they would sort of say, well, yeah, that's something that should be done away with, right? If there is a difference there, it's sort of a difference that is due to an oppressive system, right? Not due to any natural difference between men and women. Now, these days, I think feminists are often sort of more open to the possibility of there being some real gender differences, right? Some sort of natural, you could say, gender differences, um, while insisting that these differences don't entail that, right, um, any sort of inferiority, right, on the part of women. So, in fact, in the whole, sort of whole point of this care ethics approach is that a sort of distinctively feminine way of thinking about ethical theory is actually sort of an advance, right, in ethical theory. So, as a way to frame these sorts of differences, uh, we can look to sort of the psychological account by a psychologist named Kohlberg, who sort of studied moral development in children. And according to Kohlberg, right after observing these children, he marked out 6 stages of moral development, and they are here as follows, right? So it's stage one, so and they go from sort of less sophisticated to more sophisticated. So earlier, youngest children, right? They'll simply obey authority and try to avoid punishment, right? Um, then at the next level, they'll try to sort of satisfy their own desires, but also let other people do the same, and sometimes do a little trading, right? A little exchange, so that both can get what they want. So that's a little step up, right? And then step three involves cultivating relationships with other people and performing the duties appropriate to your social roles. Stage four, obeying the law, thinking about and maintaining the welfare of the group. Stage five, upholding basic rights and values of your society. And then stage six, abiding by abstract universal moral principles, right? Now, in this course, we've been largely, right, talking about stage six. This is sort of advanced, you're undergrads at a good university, you're at the top, right? He's talking about children, right, from like in toddlers on up through sort of like, so you should be, according to Kohlberg, you're right up at stage six, and this is what we've been talking about, right? Deontology in particular, right? Kant, these are abstract universal moral principles, right? Um, so that was the basic idea of Kohlberg, right? So now how this factors into care ethics is as follows. Take this one example. So this is a little sort of scenario that Kohlberg would tell the children and then ask them sort of how they would respond, and he sort of used this to rate their stages of development, right? So he would talk about a man named Heinz, right? And he'd say, okay, Heinz's wife is very sick, right? She's going to die, and her only hope um, survive is a drug, a new drug that's been discovered by a pharmacist. But the pharmacist, right, because he knows it's such a huge advance, is selling it for an outrageously high price. So the drug only costs the pharmacist $200 to make, but the pharmacist is selling it for $2,000, right, at 1,000% markup. Um, so Heinz is trying to get together enough money to get this drug to save his wife's life, and he manages to scrape together $1,000. He goes to the pharmacist, says, "Hey, can we make a deal? I've got $1,000." And the pharmacist says, "Sorry, the price is 2,000." Heinz promises to pay the rest later. Pharmacist says, "No, sorry, I need cash up front." Now, Heinz is desperate to save his wife, and he considers just breaking in and stealing the drug. And then Kohlberg asks the children, would that be wrong, right? Here's Jake, an 11-year-old, right? Um, and Jake thinks Heinz should steal the drug, right? And he justifies the action as follows. He says, well, for one thing, a human life is worth more than money. And if the druggist only makes $1,000, he's still going to live. But if Heinz doesn't steal the drug, his wife is going to die. And Kohlberg asks, why is life worth more than money? Well, because the druggist can get $1,000 later from rich people with cancer, but Heinz can't get his wife again. He asks the child, why not? Well, because people are all different, and so you couldn't get Heinz's wife again. So you might see in here sort of some abstract moral principles, right? Human life is worth more than money. And why? Because people are all different, right? This was something that Kant talked about, right? That each human is sort of supreme value because they're irreplaceable, right? If you have a child and it dies, you can't just replace it by having another child, right? Um, so this is sort of indicative of like a higher stage of moral development. Now here's another 11-year-old, Amy, right? And this is her response to the scenario, right? Should Heinz steal the drug? And Amy says, well, no, I don't think so. I think there might be other ways besides stealing it, like if he could borrow the money or make a loan or something, but he really shouldn't steal the drug. But his wife shouldn't die either. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife, but if he did, he might have to go to jail, and then his wife might get sicker again, and he couldn't get more of the drug, and it might not be good. So they should really just talk it out and find some other way to make the money. So now notice here, Amy is um, not really citing any universal moral principles, right? Like Jake was. She doesn't say anything about human life is worth more than money, right? Humans are irreplaceable or anything like that. She's kind of refusing to play the game a little bit, right? And saying, well, can't we do both, right? Can you get the drug but not have to steal, right? Why exactly is that the choice, right? Can't we talk it out, kind of? Right. So Amy's essentially refusing to give a simple yes or no answer, and the researcher keeps prodding her, and she just won't go there, right? She just refuses to accept the terms of the scenario and insists on reframing it as something that can be worked out, right? That needs to be worked out between Heinz and the pharmacist. So Kohlberg placed Amy at stage 3 of personal development, right, where the focus is on developing personal relationships, and those relationships guide your approach to morality. And he puts Jake in a much higher stage, right, because Jake is talking about these general principles. Life is worth more than money. Now along comes Carol Gilligan, right, who several decades later looks at Kohlberg's research and Kohlberg's sort of interpretation of the behavior and says, I think, right, Kohlberg's missing something important here, right? Clearly, there's differences between the way Jake and Amy are thinking about this situation and the way they're reasoning morally. Um, but it's not clear that Kohlberg is correct to place Jake at a higher level of moral reasoning than Amy. Um, and instead, Gilligan says maybe this is a sort of a gender difference, right, in the way we approach morality. Um, and so Jake's approach only seems superior if you assume a sort of male approach to ethics, which is this abstract and general approach, right, that we've seen in some large dominantly male theorists of right the last few centuries, Kant, Mill, and so on, right? Um, this is a very different approach than what Amy's up to, which is again focused on relationships, caring, intimacy, right? So Gilligan claims that men want to abstract away the details of the situation, right, and just right, force a yes or no answer, whereas women want to focus on the details, right, and Amy's sort of questioning uh, the details of the scenario and why they can't have right the best of both worlds. Um, and notice that Amy is worried about Hines, right, about what would happen to his family if he stole the drug and went to jail and so on. So Gilligan notices, right? I mean, Kohlberg did correctly identify that Amy was focused on relationships, right? But Gilligan's questioning his assumption that that's a somehow a lower level of moral development. So instead, Gilligan says, look, there's just women have a different approach to ethics, right? Um, she characterizes it as involving other people's perspectives, right? You take into account other people and the way they're thinking. And so this is reflected in Amy, right? She won't completely discount the pharmacist's point of view, right? Which is what Jake says. Jake says, look, you should steal it. Human life is worth more than money, right? So he's not even thinking about how that would affect the pharmacist, right? Amy um, won't let go of like both people and having the best outcome for both of them. She really wants to talk to the pharmacist, bring the pharmacist on board with the situation, have everyone agree. Um, so Virginia Held, another theorist, has sort of summarized this, what has come to be known as care ethics, right? Uh, care ethical approach as this. The central idea is that caring, empathy, feeling with others, being sensitive to each other's feelings, all may be better guides to what morality requires in actual contexts than may the abstract rules of reasons or rational calculation. Um, or at least, right, these, right, caring and empathy and so on, may be necessary components, at least, of an adequate morality, right? You can't just get by on abstract reasoning. You also need um, this sort of empathy. So this is what Gilligan claims. It's plausible, right? It's interesting. So the question is it true, right? If there are in fact differences between male and female approaches to ethics, we should be able to determine that scientifically, right? That is ultimately an empirical question. So is there research on the subject? There is a bit, right? So some research does indicate that there are differences between men and women in the way they approach ethics. So women do seem to score higher on empathy tests than men. Um, brain scans on women when they're seeing people being punished that shows that they enjoy it less than men do. And it does seem that women care more than about close personal relationships than men when they, you can do sort of surveys, figure out whether there are sort of average differences. Um, So yeah, there are differences, right? But if you think about it, whatever differences there are, they can't be all that extreme. Um, in the end, men and women largely agree on sort of our basic moral judgments, right? It's not that men think murder is great and women think it's wrong or something like that. We both agree, yeah, murder is wrong, right? And it's not like a man can't understand Amy's approach and that, yeah, that would be better, right, if they could compromise or work out something. Um, and women would in general agree to the abstract principles that Jake points out. Sure, of course, human life is worth more than money, right? Um, and what differences there are, right? These are statistical differences, right? Differences in the means, the averages, right? But of course, um, certain individuals are going to overlap. Some men will be more empathetic than some women, and so on, right? But there does appear to be some differences. So Gilligan is not totally off base. Um, but just finding differences is sort of not totally satisfying. You'd also like to understand why, right? And this was important. Remember that feminists often said, well, when you find differences, um, sometimes that's just a social thing and sort of a result of a repressive society or something like that. And differences should sometimes be done away with. So if there are these sort of relatively small but maybe important statistical differences between how men and women think about ethics, like what is the explanation, right? Um, one option is that it's social, right? And uh, men and women have definitely throughout history been sort of directed into different roles in society, right? So for centuries, women were largely in the home, and if their focus was more on personal relationships and where men were whatever going to war and things like that, then they might develop different sort of priorities when it comes to ethics, right? Um, you know, childcare is your main job. Yeah, you're going to be a more caring person. You're going to think more about that stuff. So that's certainly possible that it's like sort of been socially constructed. Um, it's also possible that there's genetic differences. It does seem to be some evidence that newborn girls are more interested in looking at faces than newborn boys, which might, right, indicate an or sort of a genetic predisposition to sort of wanting to build relationships with other people. Um, so what we have, so maybe there are these differences, right? But is care ethics, right, the sort of feminine approach to ethics, is this in any way superior, right? Is it better? Um, and there are some areas where it does seem to get the right answer, right? Um, so first of all, it makes sense of what felt so wrong about the impartiality of utilitarianism, right? So you remember one of the problems with utilitarianism was that, oh, okay, right, you've got the trolley problem, and it's if you're right, if your mom is tied to one track and there's five people on the other track, utilitarianism seems to say you got to sacrifice your mom to save five, and everyone feels instinctively a sort of revulsion toward that prospect. Um, from a care ethical sort of lens, that makes sense, right? Because right, our approach to morality is rooted in our duties, right, in certain relationships with others. It would totally make sense that the closer the relationship, the greater the moral duty you have to them, right? So it sort of makes sense of why, yeah, you treat your parents and your children and your spouse better than you treat other people, right? And that's sort of kind of impossible psychologically for humans to really, like as utilitarianism demands, put just as much weight on the welfare of someone across the country as on your own spouse, right? That's just like it seems hard. How would you live your life that way, right? And care ethics makes a little more sense of that. Yeah, no. If ethics is rooted in our relationships and closer relationships, greater moral duties, right? Um, so where utilitarianism entails that you should never spend a latte when that money could be used to help a starving child on the other side of the world, um, right? Care ethics prioritizes sort of any wherever you're in contact with people, right? Um, and it's going to be the circle is going to be relatively small, right? So you seem to have more duty to people that are closer to you, and as it spreads out, your duties are less and less. And so when they get to the other side of the world, it seems like your duties, those folks are relatively minimal. Um, remember as well, utilitarianism required that we treat any creature capable of suffering as equal in our moral calculus, right? So non-human animals count just as much as humans. Um, but and some of us, even if you're a vegan, right, um, it seems hard to say, well, I would, whatever, I would pull the lever and kill my mom to save five pigs or something like that, right? Um, on the in the trolley problem. And again, care ethics makes sense of why, even if we care about animals and we care about their suffering, we tend to care about humans more just because we develop much more rich and intense relationships with humans. And those animals that we do develop intense and rich relationships with, like our pets, we do feel a higher ethical duty to them than sort of like, right, cattle in a lot somewhere. Um, so care ethics does sort of make sense of some of these intuitions, right? And that were a problem for some other theories. I'm just picking utilitarianism as an example. Um, so is that evidence? Well, I mean, we have been using our intuitions as evidence here, right? Um, but there is always reason to doubt our intuitions as well, right? So 200 years ago, if we were taking an ethics class, probably most of the people would have had the intuition that, yeah, slavery is a perfectly good thing and it's perfectly natural and it's really the best thing for the slaves and so on. And they would feel revulsion at the idea of right interracial marriage and things like that. So, you can have bad intuitions, right? Um, So kind of leaving it there as an open question, right? I know it's week 5. Um, this is a nice tight 20 minutes, right? I don't, and you've got an essay to write, so I don't want to stress you out too much. So I'm sort of introducing the notion of care ethics. You find this interesting. Um, I can point you towards more literature on the subject if you think this is like a really promising approach to ethics, even though we didn't spend quite as much time on it as utilitarianism and deontology. Um, I'm just sort of whetting your appetite here for more care ethics if you're. Uh, all right, so the next lecture will be on virtue ethics, which is another sort of different approach, and then we'll have a final lecture where we sort of sum up. Uh, so I will see you then.